What's up internet, Harvest Build Destroy here, and in this video I'm going to continue my discussion of the upcoming Frost Giant game. In part 1, I gave an overview of what we know so far and began discussing both what I expect to see in the game and what I hope to see, focusing mostly on the game's economy. As I said in that video, I'm going to start this one by discussing the difference between how StarCraft 1 and 2's mineral economies scale, and then I'm going to move into unit movement and AI. And like with the first video, I'll be assuming that Frost Giant end up developing a macro-oriented RTS as opposed to one centered around hero units. This hasn't been made official, of course, and for the record, I do actually think there's a case to be made for them developing a hero RTS, but I'm going to address that separately in its own video. So without any further ado, in StarCraft 1 vs 2, there's a difference in how much benefit you get out of each additional worker you task to minerals at a given base, depending on how many are already working. In StarCraft 2, each additional worker increases your mineral income rate by roughly the same amount, up until you exceed 2 workers per patch. After that, each additional worker barely increases your income rate at all, and for all intents and purposes we can consider it saturated. A term I've heard used to describe this is 100% mining efficiency. In Brood War, on the other hand, the decline in mineral income rate begins after you exceed 1 worker per patch, but is much more gradual. Each one increases your income rate by slightly less than the previous one, up until the expansion is fully saturated at 3 workers per patch. With the Brood War model, spreading the same number of workers across a larger number of expansions results in a higher mineral income, but with the StarCraft 2 model, the number of bases your workers are spread across doesn't affect mineral income as long as you're not oversaturating. As many have pointed out, this simple difference has a pretty profound effect on how matches tend to play out in each game. The main point that's been raised is that due to this difference in mineral scaling, there isn't much incentive to have more than 3 actively mining bases at once in StarCraft 2, which tends to reward more passive turtley play. Efficiency-wise, 3 fully saturated bases is around the ideal proportion of your supply to dedicate to workers, so there's really no point of spreading yourself thin by trying to defend a 4th location that isn't really going to give you an economic advantage. I don't have too much to add to this myself, other than to say that I agree, and that I'm glad to hear that Frost Giant are at least experimenting with Brood War's more gradual mineral scaling model. Assuming they opt to go for a no-hero game, which again, at least for the purposes of this video I am, this scaling model would intuitively seem to me to be the way to go, as it would add an extra layer to the player's decisions regarding where and when to expand. If you were to take map control, you could gain an additional economic advantage by spreading your workers over a larger number of expansions. However, like I just alluded to, doing this would spread your defenses more thinly since you would have to defend a larger number of locations at once, which could give your opponent opportunities for counterplay. This added layer of reciprocal decision-making would seem to me to be a net positive for Frost Giant's game, but ultimately this will depend on what directions they choose to take the game's various other mechanics. You know, the whole interlocking web of design choices thing again. If the possibility of outmuscling your opponent with an economic advantage through skillful map control is a dynamic that aligns with their vision for the game, Brood War-style scaling will probably be a good thing. But if the game's focus is less on macro and map control and more on unit composition and skillful use of castable abilities, perhaps not as much. These are both perfectly legitimate ways to design an RTS, it just depends on what kind of game they decide they want to make. I'd prefer to see them lean a bit more toward the macro end of the spectrum myself, but ultimately, regardless of the specific direction they choose to take, what I'm hoping for in broad conceptual terms is for their game to find its own niche on the RTS spectrum. Ideally one that simultaneously is as unique as it can be, while still retaining the basic flavor of Blizzard RTS. In even broader terms, I want there to be true diversity among the genre's major titles, such that we have too many rather than too few quality modern RTS games to choose from that are meaningfully different from each other. So in particular, I'm hoping they'll be very deliberate about making their game meaningfully different from StarCraft 2, and altering its resource scaling model would seem to me to be a good place to start. If you're wondering why I would single out StarCraft 2 as opposed to both StarCraft 1 and 2, there are a couple reasons. As both a legacy game and one that was a large-scale cultural phenomenon in a specific place, South Korea, StarCraft 1 would not seem to me to be in direct competition with Frost Giant's game in quite the same way. The vast majority of its player base is older and has been playing it for years and years, so you're dealing with nostalgia and an entrenched South Korean esports culture. It's not a bad demographic for Frost Giant's game to potentially glean some players from, but I doubt the two games will be at significant loggerheads. The thing is, I'm not entirely convinced that the idea of creating a modern game that truly feels all that much like Brood War is even possible anyway, so I don't really view it as much of a concern. So much of what makes it the game it is stems from the various restrictions to its 1998 user interface, and I think it's safe to assume that Frost Giant's game will have a modern interface. The 12-unit selection cap and the lack of multiple building select and automine are the main reasons that Brood War has its infamous infinite macro skill ceiling, and that is a large part of what defines it as a game. Without restrictions such as these, I don't know if an infinite macro skill ceiling is even possible for a game with a Blizzard-style economy. This, as I see it, is the exact problem that StarCraft 2 was designed to solve. To put it simply, what other mechanics can be altered to keep the skill ceiling as high as possible in light of the unavoidable drop in macro difficulty that comes with a modern interface? StarCraft II solved this problem in a number of fairly clever ways, largely by introducing new mechanics that require manual player input. Unit castable abilities are much more common, and each race gained a manual macro mechanic: Larva Inject, Mules, and Chrono Boost. The game speed was also substantially increased, units were made to be much more mobile with abilities allowing them to bypass terrain, and buildings were made to be much more fragile. Frostgiant have made it fairly clear that they won't be deviating too far from the style of economy found in Blizzard games, so this is presumably a problem they will have to solve with their game too. And I think it behooves them to solve it in as different of a way as possible from the way it was solved in StarCraft 2, without throwing the basic Blizzard formula out with the bathwater in the process. While adding manual macro mechanics and making significant use of unit castable abilities are probably a given, I hope they won't follow in StarCraft 2's footsteps when it comes to upping the game speed and going for an overall volatile game with such mobile units and fragile buildings. This formula obviously works, of course, as StarCraft 2's enduring popularity clearly demonstrates, but I don't view having Frostgiant's game merely supplant StarCraft 2 in the RTS hierarchy as a desirable outcome, and I don't think you should either. In the first place, I have a hard time imagining any game not called StarCraft 3 truly killing it anyway, but even if it was possible, it probably wouldn't be such a good thing for the genre as a whole, no matter how good the game was in its own right. We need there to be an example of an RTS game developed this century with a track record of staying power. If even Blizzard's flagship franchise can't sustain a player base over time, what kind of message does that send to other developers thinking of trying their hand at the genre? The goal should be peaceful coexistence, to the extent that it's possible. Sure, StarCraft 2's player base will inevitably take a sizable hit when Frostgiant's game comes out, but we should want it to survive that hit. So the question is, how could Frostgiant approach making a modern RTS game with clear Blizzard DNA that is also a decidedly separate experience from StarCraft 2, such that different players may choose to play one or the other for equally valid subjective reasons? There are more ways than I could ever hope to cover in this video, of course, and like I said, experimenting with resource scaling models is certainly a good start, but the other one I'm going to focus on here is unit movement and AI. This, along with the aforementioned increase in game speed and overall volatility, are some of the main areas where I hope they will deviate significantly from StarCraft 2. Even as far back as Wings of Liberty beta, something always felt a little off to me about the way the units felt when they moved around. I've never liked how readily they bump each other out of the way to go exactly where you click, almost like they're covered in butter or oil or something. If you have a blob of units and you select one on the outside and order it to move to the opposite side, the rest of them will automatically reorganize themselves to create a perfect path for that unit to travel along with essentially no friction. Basically, unit collision is all but non-existent, at least as far as your own units are concerned. This contrasts pretty sharply with previous Blizzard games, which featured much more robust unit collision. This is especially apparent in Warcraft 3, where a lot of the more advanced micros centered around using units to block each other. Bumping seems to apply a bit of inertia in Warcraft 3, and although I do think it's fair to say that unit blocking is more relevant in a hero RTS, I nonetheless think this mechanic is worth experimenting with. Yes, it's true that Warcraft 3 and Brood War units aren't, strictly speaking, the sharpest tools in the shed. The overall pathfinding of the units in Frostgiant's game obviously has to be up to modern standards, but there are certain virtues to the way units behaved in those games, such as inertia, that I think ought to at least be experimented with. And if successful, this could potentially go a long way toward carving out a unique niche for the game on the modern RTS landscape. Something a bit more on the subtle side that Brood War handles exceptionally well is unit acceleration and turn rate. I'm hardly the only one out there who thinks that when it comes to the way units feel when they move around, no RTS game has ever come close to Brood War, before or since. Artosis often says that the only reason he never off-races as Zerg is that there just aren't enough hours in the day for him to get good enough at Mutalisk Micro for it to be worth the bother. It's not uncommon for Zerg pro gamers to spend as much as half their total practice time on micro custom maps mastering the idiosyncrasies of this one unit. And if you've played the game even a little, you'll probably agree that there's nothing quite like moving a control group of Dragoons around, especially when a ramp is involved. Anyway, I don't think all of this can be chalked up to antiquated pathfinding. By carefully dialing in unique acceleration and turn rates for each unit, perhaps Frostgiant could salvage at least some of what made Brood War's various units feel so satisfyingly different to move around, without having to intentionally hamstring the overall pathfinding. Company of Heroes is another example of a game that handles this same concept quite well, despite being a very different type of RTS. Because of their different rates of acceleration, on top of the independent turn rates of both their turrets and their tracks, Company of Heroes' various tanks feel pretty different from each other in the way they move around too. If Frostgiant choose a setting that allows for tanks, playing around with independent turn rates for their tracks and turrets is worthy of consideration. Or, even if there were no tanks, perhaps there could be units whose slow turn rates could be exploited by other, more mobile units. Also, I think the ability to tell your vehicles which direction you want them to face in Company of Heroes by right-clicking and dragging in that direction, as well as the ability to order a vehicle to move in reverse, are interesting mechanics that Frost Giant should at least think about. The last thing I want to go into here is very much a shot in the dark. To return to the idea of unit auto-bumping and the resultant lack of friction in StarCraft 2, I have a theory about why it works this way. But it is, admittedly, complete and utter conjecture, as I know essentially nothing about programming a video game. Basically, I assume, or rather my best guess, is that the reason this auto-bumping occurs is that unlike in Brood War or Warcraft 3, the units seem to function like a sort of hive mind. My guess is that when you give a unit an order in StarCraft 2, the other units in its path automatically become aware of that order and act accordingly to make sure exactly that happens, including preemptively moving out of that unit's way if necessary, despite not being issued an order themselves. If I'm right about this, I'm also guessing that it accounts for the difference in mineral scaling between StarCraft 1 and 2. Subjectively, as a layman merely watching StarCraft 2 workers mine, it does at least appear that they're always aware of exactly which mineral patch is the most efficient one for them to travel to, and this is perhaps the reason why they mine at 100% efficiency. If I'm right about this, mineral scaling and general unit AI could be codependent in this sense, but even if I'm wrong about the exact mechanism behind it, StarCraft 2 units nonetheless do subjectively feel a bit more like automatons, while units in Brood War or Warcraft 3 feel more like, well, units, in the sense that they operate independently based on the orders you give them. Yeah, they may also have their fair share of wacky, senior AI moments, but I suspect there may be a happy medium somewhere, one that doesn't involve intentionally programming units to be stupid, but that still leaves at least some room for your units to get in each other's way if you give them heavy-handed orders. For example, perhaps instead of all your units always being aware of each other's orders, they could only be aware of the current trajectories and velocities of the units in their immediate line of sight. This way, they could still calculate the best path to take based on these vectors, but not on the same superhuman hive mind level. Perhaps this, or something along these lines, could be that sweet spot between the smoothness of StarCraft 2 and the personality of its predecessors. And that's just about all I have to say for part 2. The point I want to leave you with is not to take my assessment of any of these mechanics as anything more than food for thought or a starting point. This is obviously all pretty armchair speculative on my part, and I could easily be wrong about the optimal direction to innovate towards with any of these mechanics. The important part is that these design elements will hopefully be given careful consideration as Frost Giant embark on the arduous path of experimentation and iteration that I can only assume goes along with developing a polished RTS in 2021. That's all for this one though. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, I would greatly appreciate it if you were to like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, etc., you know, all the YouTube algorithm stuff. See you soon.